Good morning. Thank you for joining us for our December presentation in the 5th year of our speaker series, Toxicology and Societies, the Impact of Chemicals in Our Lives. I'm Ian Moran, a visiting assistant professor of environmental toxicology and chemistry at Western Washington University. I'm joined by my co-host, Ruth Sofield. Hi, Ruth.
Hi there, Ian.
Our other co-host, Tracy Collier, was unable to join us this morning. We would like to begin by acknowledging that we at Western Washington University are on the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish peoples who have lived in the Salish Sea Basin throughout the San Juan Islands and the North Cascades watershed from time immemorial. Please join us in expressing our deepest respect and gratitude for our Indigenous neighbors, the Lummi Nation and Nooksack tribe, for their enduring care and protection of our shared lands and waterways. And now I'd like to go over a few logistics. We will save questions for the end of the presentation, but you can use the Q&A feature on your screen at any time. You will be muted throughout the presentation, so we will use this feature to interact. The focus of our speaker series is to provide understandable examples of how events with a toxicological component have consequences to people and society. Today, we are delighted to welcome Dr. Blair Pollock-Aguilar. Dr. Pollock-Aguilar is a senior technical policy analyst with the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality's Environmental Cleanup Program. Today, she will present on the program's strategic vision for the future. Welcome, Dr. Pollock-Aguilar.
Thank you so much, Ian, and thank you for the invitation. Let me go ahead and share my slides.
Okay.
Can you all hear me all right?
Yes.
All right, just 1 second. We'll get the right screen here. Okay. Are you seeing?
Looks great.
Okay, there we go. Well, again, thank you so much, Ian and Ruth and all for the invitation. I'm very excited to be here. Like Ian said, my name is Blair Pollock-Aguilar, and I am here today to talk about a visioning project that we're doing in the Environmental Cleanup Program in the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. So I wanted to start by sharing a little bit about myself and my background, because I think it's relevant in so far as helping illustrate why I'm so motivated to prioritize the things that we're prioritizing in the visioning project for the Environmental Cleanup Program, and why things like systematic change and incorporating equity are really motivating to me. So I got my PhD in environmental toxicology at Oregon State University, and I'll talk a little bit about my research background and again some of the experiences that I had there and what kind of prompted me to take my career in the direction that I have so far. I graduated with my PhD in 2016, and then since then I've done environmental toxicology work actually in all three of the sectors. I've did a postdoc in the research space and academia, and then have worked in environmental consulting and applied environmental toxicology spaces, and then was hired as a toxicologist and a cleanup project manager at the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality a few years ago. And then just for the last year or so have moved into this more policy-focused role in the Environmental Cleanup Program at DEQ. So, like I said, I wanted to start by sharing a little bit about my research background. And I wanted to highlight this project in part because this was a project that we did looking at fossil fuels and contamination and how they move through the environment and how folks are exposed to them, specifically in Salish Sea. So very close to where you all are there in Bellingham. This project was outside of Anacortes. And we were looking at uptake of fossil fuels, specifically polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. You can see a few of them. There's structures, chemical structures there on the screen. We were looking at uptake of PAHs and other fossil fuel breakdown products in clams and trying to develop models of how we could predict that contamination in the clams using a less invasive tool, a passive sampling device. But one of the things that was most impactful for me about this project is that we were working collaboratively with multiple of the tribes in the Salish Sea to do this project. And so it was a truly community engaged, tribal engaged in this case, project where we were working directly with multiple different tribes. And they were at the table throughout the whole process, deciding what questions we were asking, what types of clams we were sampling, everything. And it was really their questions that we were trying to answer with our research project. And this was really impactful for me because it was one of the first real, true applied projects that I did in the beginning of my career. And it really had an impact on me because I think really if we're not able to get our science into the hands of the people who are most impacted by it, then what are we doing? And then, so that project in the Northwest, in the Salish Sea right here at home with the tribes, incredibly impactful for me. And then another project that we did is, there's some pictures here, was looking at air quality impacts. Again, hydrocarbons, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons come from fossil fuels and combustion. And in this case, we were working, again, directly, very closely with a concerned citizens group, in this case, in Ohio, in rural Ohio, that was having natural gas extraction, fracking, coming into its community. You can see in the picture on the left there, one of these big natural gas extraction fracking well pads covered in snow, but that is on the property of the person who's there walking with one of my colleagues toward the well pad. And so we were on people's properties, in people's yards, shaking their hands, working with them to put up these air samplers on their properties. You can see our research team there on the right. And that's one of our air samplers on a tree, and that's someone's house. And so again, really early in my career, I was, a second year, third year graduate student, fresh out of undergrad. All of a sudden I'm in these people's yards and, being a toxicology student, they're asking me questions like, well, what does this mean for my health? What can this study really show me? And pretty quickly I realized that for me to feel like I could walk through those conversations with the amount of respect and justice that I felt like they deserved, I wanted more training and more understanding of how to effectively communicate about risk. And I also started thinking a lot about how we get all of this great science and research information that we're working on, again, into the hands of the people who are really most impacted by it. So for me, that led to wanting to get more training in science outreach and in risk communication, and really to lean into those communities. And so in a lot of volunteer time and just kind of on my own time, I started to kind of supplement my educational experience and my work experience with outreach and training in that space. So I did a science communication fellowship with the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry, OMSI, here in Portland, back when I was in graduate school. You can see on the left there, I developed a tabletop demonstration about the research I was just talking about, the air quality research, to just get people having conversations about air pollution and environmental quality and chemicals in the environment and what that really means for our health and how it impacts them. And then on the right, something that I'm excited about right now is I'm still volunteering at OMSI, but I've started to bring that actually into my work at DEQ. And so I'm working with folks across DEQ to figure out how we can maybe develop OMSI, that relationship with OMSI, into a platform where we can share science and kind of have two-way dialogue about the work that we're doing with the people. And then through CTAC, some here may be familiar with CTAC, the Society of Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry. It's our professional society in environmental toxicology. I got very involved at the global level in developing a science and risk communication interest group, and had a lot of incredible experiences through that, and really developed a lot of great connections in the community practice, learned a lot from a lot of good people there. On the left, one of the coolest professional experiences I've ever had, I got to co-facilitate a risk communication training at the CTAC African branch meeting in Cape Town in South Africa. And so that is groups of scientists from all over Africa engaging about risk communication. And one of the most powerful things for me about that was some of the same things that I was feeling when I was, on those folks' properties in Ohio, or when I was working with the tribes in the Salish Sea about, really wanting to better understand the impact of these chemicals on our health and get that information to the people. The exact same conversations we were having with these folks about pesticide exposures around Africa. And in some cases in parts of the world where there's, the regulations are less stringent, that connection between the toxics and the exposures was even more real for people. People were talking about, exposures that they had seen and impact. So really powerful. It really drove home for me how important this is, and that there's a need there. And then the pandemic hit, and I was seeing that, everywhere around me. So I wrote this letter to the editor about how we need better risk communication and better science in the hands of the people. So that is a lot of the why all of this matters to me, and why I've decided to take my career in the direction that I have so far. And so moving into, the bread and butter of the talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about the DEQ Cleanup Program, what it is, how it works. I know a lot of that was not intuitive to me when I was even in graduate school. And then talk a little bit about our process of trying to develop a vision for the program to modernize, to look a little bit different moving into the future. And for me, that's really centered in equity, and making sure that we're centering disproportionately impacted communities and tribes and folks who are most impacted by the program's work and often have been underrepresented in the process so far. Make sure I find the turtle video here. So as it is written in rule and in statute, the purpose of the DEQ cleanup program is to assure protection of the present and future public health, safety, and welfare of the environment in the event of a release or threat of release of a hazardous substance by determining the removal and remedial action necessary. So that's important because in the regulatory world, we really have to be beholden to what our rules and statutes say. The legislature decides, and approves our statutes, and then we, to some extent, are able to write rules that underpin our program. But we are more or less bound by the jurisdiction that those rules and statutes give us. So we don't have authority to do things, too much that are outside of that. And so, figuring out how to change that is a lot of a lot of work and can be pretty complicated. And I have to mention that our turtle friend here is from a project that I worked on when I was in consulting, but it's a DEQ cleanup project where we were remediating this pond behind the turtle and trying to protect this population of Western painted turtles. And so I wrote a whole turtle management plan and got to go out and do some turtle sampling. So you'll see some turtles throughout the presentation today. So I mentioned we're really bound by our regulatory backdrop and what the laws say and the rules say, and we don't have authority, for instance, to require sampling or cleanup of something beyond that. And so that makes it really interesting to figure out how to do something different or require something that's more holistic or more expansive. So I won't bore you too much with laws and all of that, but briefly, for those who are interested in laws and policy, our Oregon Environmental Cleanup Program is structured largely off of the federal cleanup law, which the main one that we have is references CERCLA, the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act. At the federal level. And I do want to call out that the DEQ cleanup program, the folks who were, involved in developing the rules originally in the late 80s into the 90s, really were leaders nationwide in developing a program that was trying to be consistent with, or even in some cases more protective than that federal cleanup program. Importantly, a component of the federal CERCLA cleanup program that is also true of our Oregon cleanup program is that we ask the responsible parties, the polluters, to cover the costs of the cleanup for the most part. And we could have a much longer conversation about the pros and cons of that. But it means that we don't have necessarily a lot of just general fund dollars sitting around to do things just that we decide are the right thing to do. Often we are working with the responsible party and maybe their consultant to make decisions about what's necessary for the site, which again means that it's important to have the rules and the policies and guidance and everything codified in a way that we're confident is going to holistically protect folks and the environment. So I mentioned, just kind of dialing in here briefly, that our cleanup laws in Oregon are largely modeled after the federal CERCLA, and really that the crux of what we have jurisdiction to do is to regulate hazardous substances, releases of hazardous substances into the environment. And that's just some language there about specifically how that's defined, and that matters. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the process of a site entering the cleanup program and what we do. So like I mentioned, we really only have jurisdiction to evaluate the presence of releases of hazardous substances into the environment. And then importantly, in the context of this conversation about toxicology and how it affects, how it comes into these decisions and how it's incorporated into these processes. A part of this process of each cleanup site is determining what animals, people, plants are exposed to, what chemicals at the site. But as we know as toxicologists, there's a lot of nuance there. How many chemicals are you looking for? What thresholds are you using to evaluate what's a safe level or an acceptable level of risk that you might have at that site? So all of that feeds into what we call a risk assessment, and then that feeds into a larger, what we call a remedial investigation that we use to then decide, okay, what needs to happen at this site? Does there need to be cleanup? Does there need to be removal? And in some cases, there's not adequate resources to completely clean up or completely remove. And so what other mitigation measures might there need to be? So as you can imagine, a lot of nuance that goes into that, and that's where we need, that really good toxicological science and policies and laws to give us the jurisdiction to do what we need to do to really be confident that we're being holistic in our evaluations and our cleanups. Again, because we're here talking about, toxicology, I wanted to zero in a little bit on that exposure and risk piece of the process. I mentioned that a key piece of any cleanup site evaluation and decision-making process is evaluating the chemicals that are there, collecting samples, figuring out what levels they're at, and then comparing those to thresholds that we have. And a part of that process is developing a conceptual site model, we call it, or sort of a framework for thinking about how chemicals move through the site, where they might come from. Often in the cleanup program, we're dealing with legacy, like very old sites that maybe, the facility hasn't been operational for decades even, and it's just been sitting there. But then it's important to understand the site history. And then you need an understanding of environmental fate and transport, as well as, toxicology and how chemicals move through the environment. So there's so much that needs to go into this. And, personally, one thing that I'm really interested in all of our visioning and strategic planning work for the program is making sure that all of the nuance in all of these decisions gets carried through, and that, again, that we have the resources and the expertise to make sure that we're being thorough in how we think through each of these pieces, because it can really matter if you don't include a chemical or an exposure pathway that is relevant or that could be relevant in the future if the property use changes, for instance, in your conceptual site model and in your evaluation, and that risk evaluation that then feeds into the decision making about what needs to happen at that site, how much removal is needed, how much cleanup is needed. Do you need to put a cap over the site if you're not able to remove all of the contamination, for instance? in order to do that well and be confident that we're making those decisions in a way that's going to confidently protect people and ecosystems, then we need that good understanding and toxicological information to be at every step of that process. I wanted to talk a little bit about different examples of sites that we have in our program, because sometimes when folks hear cleanup, they're not totally sure what I'm talking about or what we really do, what types of things are we cleaning up. And the truth is it varies, but the majority of our sites I would say fall into these categories. So there's a few pictures here of an abandoned mine. That's a big one in the Northwest, as I'm sure is not surprising to folks. And then a lot of our sites are former industrial sites, like I alluded to earlier. Or maybe, you can see the construction there. Maybe there was a facility where there were spills for over a long period of time. One thing that can get complicated is a lot of times these facilities were operating before a lot of our current environmental regulations were in place, and the way that the federal Comprehensive Environmental Response and Liability Act, as well as our Oregon laws, are written is that the property owner is responsible for the contamination, including financially responsible for the contamination. So you can imagine this gets really complicated. And then the far right picture there is, you see an overturned truck. We do also work very closely with our emergency response program statewide in our cleanup program. And so those folks are the ones actually going out if there's an oil spill, or even on a small scale, something like this, if a truck carrying something hazardous spills, is in an accident or something like that, then we have folks who go out and, are collecting samples in some cases or figuring out what's needed. This is just a snapshot of the sites that are in our program right now. This includes all sites. It's not just active sites. So some of these are closed or they're just in the program, but we haven't gotten to them yet. We have a wait list of sites. Can always use more resources. But you can see they're spread all over the state, not surprisingly, clustered around urban areas, but there are a lot of them. It says here at this time, we took the snapshot a month or so ago, about, almost 6,000 different facilities. And I would argue that this is not even necessarily comprehensive, because again, the way that our rules are structured and the way that the jurisdiction that we have means that a lot of our sites come into our program voluntarily when people know that they have an issue, or that they have the funds to pay a consultant, and they know that they're going to be liable at some point, or something like that. But we don't have authority to comprehensively evaluate contamination outside of that in a lot of cases. So plenty of work to do. So how does all of this affect you? I think we all probably know that contamination affects environmental and human health. In the case of the disproportionately impacted communities and tribes, I think of impacts to first foods and fish advisories, but there's so much more. We also know that there are emerging contaminants that we're not yet able to regulate. We right now in our program are going through rulemaking to add PFAS compounds, just two PFOA and PFAS, to our list of hazardous substances that we can regulate. But it's a slow process. And we know there are other contaminants out there that we're not able to regulate yet. And then of course we have all of the historic legacy types of contamination that we do already regulate: metals, hydrocarbons, pesticides, and more. And then, I think there are a lot of opportunities for engagement and folks as we move into this visioning phase. I think brownfields, we are hopefully, we do work with the federal brownfields program, where they're redeveloping contaminated sites and have opportunities for, community grants and things like that. But we're hoping, at some point to build out our Oregon specific brownfields program. And then there, in that decision-making process that I talked about earlier about what is an acceptable risk level, what decisions need to be made at this site, or what is enough cleanup at a site. I do think there's a lot of opportunity for folks to, if we're able to get more people, more of those voices to the table in helping us decide how we make those decisions. I think there are a lot of places where we could have conversations about what's the best way to do this. So our current community engagement, this is a picture of actual DEQ community engagement here, a few of my colleagues at one of our sites in Portland. But right now, as it stands, we have public comment periods that we offer. That's laid out, in our rules on major decision documents. Like if we get all the way to the end of a cleanup project and we've written a report that says how we're going to clean it up, we'll put that out for public comment. But we don't right now have a systematic requirement to more proactively engage communities in cleanup site decisions. And then on the tribal engagement side, the program is legally obligated by state and federal law to engage tribes in ensuring that if we're doing any ground disturbing activities, that we are protecting cultural resources. However, and then beyond that, we do engage intermittently on certain sites. I put a picture of Wapato here because I know specifically we have a site in Scappoose Bay where the project manager there is working with some of the local tribes on making sure to protect a sensitive population of Wapato in an estuary there. So there are cases where we have, great working relationships with tribes on some of our sites, but again, we don't really have that systematic requirement to more proactively engage tribes into site decisions. And there are a lot of places where I think we should. So that brings us to visioning. You can see here the mission of this visioning project that I'm leading is to inclusively decide where we want to take the DEQ program, cleanup program into the future. And we're using 2050 because it's a nice round number, but it's not just for 2050, it's for all the time between now and then and hopefully beyond. So we are largely modeling this process off of one that was conducted by one of our sister programs at DEQ about 12 plus years ago. That's actually ongoing, and that is the materials management project or program at Oregon DEQ. And I've had a lot of conversations with a lot of people who were part of this process and remain part of this process, and it's pretty inspiring to see what they were able to do. The previous program, I think it was called Solid Waste, they rebranded, was similar to cleanup in that it had some jurisdictional and kind of regulatory limitations in the way that it was set up and funding constraints in the way that it was set up. And so a small group of folks from the program and then DEQ leadership and with external, advisory groups as well, developed this 2050 vision and framework for action back in 2012. And what's exciting to me and what kind of keeps me hoping that we'll be able to do all the things we're trying to do here is that they were successful. It's an ongoing process, and anything like this will be an ongoing process, but the program today looks incredibly different from the program 10, 12, 20 years ago for materials management in Oregon, much more equity focused, much more future thinking. They're building coalitions with folks, they're hiring new people, they've got a lot more money, they've developed different funding streams. So this is kind of the gold star for us that we're trying to model off of, more or less. So goals of the project, really we've heard from our legislative analysts that we need a strategic plan and a clearly articulated vision to be on paper in order to really gain traction in any of future asks of the legislature or rulemaking that we might try to do in the program. So that is what we are trying to do, is develop that vision and see everything I said at the beginning of the talk about, my motivation and, my interest in getting good science into the hands of the people and into policies and processes that allow it to more holistically and proactively protect people and the environment. So I'm not the only one, but I am leading this effort. And so me and all other folks working on this are really trying to inclusively develop that vision and be mindful of the fact that really in its 30 plus years, the cleanup program hasn't really systematically engaged disproportionately impacted folks or tribes in the decision making or in the fabric of how the program works and how we make decisions. And so we're hoping to change that moving forward. And so, like I said, we do want to inclusively develop that vision and center tribal engagement and environmental justice in our program, in the process, but also in the program's work, ideally, moving into the future. And so we are intending to engage directly with those communities and tribes as we develop the vision. And that, ultimately our goal would be to ensure that our guidance documents, our practices, and our rules even really meet the expectations of those in proportion, especially disproportionately impacted communities and tribes. And of course, in case it's worth mentioning, if we're protecting disproportionately impacted communities and tribes, it follows that we're protecting everyone else as well. So what has happened so far? I want to just kind of briefly walk through the last few years. So this project goes probably way farther back before this, but I came to DEQ in 2021. So that's when I entered the picture. And so what I'm most familiar with. And I think that is when a lot of the really tangible movement on this project kicked off. But I think one thing I wanted to highlight is that there's not really a roadmap for this kind of work at a place like DEQ. The program has been, like I said, its inception in the 90s was a leader in nationwide, really, in its rules. And, there's been a lot of constraints, funding, otherwise. So a lot of great work being done. But a lot of that is, we're managing this cleanup site and we're making decisions about that. And it's kind of focused on one side at a time. So this kind of zooming way out, thinking big picture, trying to chart a course to 2050 for something different and more holistic is we're having to learn as we go at every step. And so importantly, in 2021, leadership in our program as well as management started to really gain traction on this idea, and they put out an all program survey and did a kind of all program listening session about this. Moving into 2022, folks applied for and successfully received a grant from the Federal Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, FIJA, which is largely what is allowing us to do this work. And then moving into 2023, we developed a steering committee. So it was composed of staff from varying tenure, varying expertise across the program. We're a pretty big program for DEQ. DEQ in total is about 800 plus people, tons of different programs, air, land, water, all kinds of programs. And the cleanup program alone is about 80 people. So we're about 10% of the whole agency. So trying to be inclusive internally as well, develop the steering committee. Trying to hear from folks with varying experiences about how they thought this program or this process should work. How do we do this? Where do we start? Like, what does it look like to try to develop a vision and a strategic plan to move into the future and do something a bit different? And then that steering committee developed a process to guide these next few steps in the phases of the visioning and starting the strategic planning process. And then this year, we started the process and actually started by working with program staff to implement what we called phase one, which was sort of documenting the state of the program by building out teams of program staff to write white papers, basically, or briefing papers, summarizing the current status and the history of different aspects of our program and how we got here. I'll talk a little bit more about that, I think, in a few slides. And then just right now, where we are is that we are developing the team and the approach and all of that to move into what we're calling phase 2, which is developing the vision. And importantly, bringing on external partners to help us facilitate and do external engagement. So I mentioned that steering committee developed this is a 3-phase process to kick us off into this visioning and strategic planning project. First one, like I mentioned, was laying down the markers, kind of documenting the state of the state. And the second one is creating the vision. That's what we're in now. And then the third will be to really build the blueprint, like actually develop legislative asks, develop a strategic plan, all of that. And that will take a long time, but we're gonna start in 2025. So I mentioned that we've already completed phase 1. That was the first half of 2024. I want to acknowledge all the folks. These are the names of all the people who were the lead authors on all of these briefing papers that we wrote. Like I said, it's really state of the program and how we got here. And so that's regulatory framework, financial health, policies, guidances, and then decision making in our program, and structure and history. So pretty interesting. But these are great resources that we had staff develop. I learned a lot through this process, and now we have those to inform the process moving forward, and just as resources for new staff or folks externally as we move through all of this. So it was pretty cool to go through that exercise. And then, so where are we now? Like I mentioned, we've developed this 3-phase process, and we are in phase 2, essentially. So developing that vision, working on gearing up for internal and external listening sessions. Next steps in phase 2 to create the vision, assembling the internal and external team. We're working on bringing on facilitators externally to help us develop this approach, and then working on developing work plans with them with more detail about exactly all the specifics of the internal and external engagement that we're going to do, and then moving into internal engagement and external engagement, and then ultimately developing those legislative concepts and plans. Briefly, the timeline moving forward. Right now, like I mentioned, we're refining the project plan and identifying those initial connections to identify interested community members and tribes. And then in 2025, we plan to do that engagement and start to develop the vision. And then moving into 2026, we plan to start developing the strategic plan and hopefully start to make some legislative asks. And then moving forward, this will go for a long time. Hopefully it will be successful if it goes longer. I think the longer it goes, the more successful it is, I see, because this is an iterative process, and it should be. I mentioned we're going to do internal listening sessions to try to work with internal staff. We have a lot of staff who've been in the program for a long time, and to try to work with them to hear their ideas about the program. So definitely want to be inclusive internally as well. And then we are also working with staff to kind of develop subgroups of our visioning team that are focused on these internal listening sessions, external listening sessions, and also kind of as larger thought partners to help research and figure out how we actually create that strategic plan and what's possible, because there could be different components of the strategic plan. It's not just legislative asks. We could create rules. We could change things administratively internally. So defining all of that and then ultimately writing the strategic plan. I mentioned we're going to do external listening sessions, working with facilitators, and the goal of that in part is to build coalitions to help us, advocate to improve future work, because it's not easy getting these things changed. Those external engagement and listening sessions, like I said, will be focused on communities and tribes. So on the community side, we're planning to work with Portland State University and are also exploring collaboration opportunities with other programs. These are some pictures from an engagement effort we did cross media with air quality and climate and water quality at OMSI recently, where we were asking people to, engage and answer some questions. And so more of this, but still determining all the specifics there. And then same thing with tribes. We're working with the Institute of Tribal Government at Portland State University and plan to do our best to engage the tribes in Oregon as meaningfully as we can, and as much as they're interested. We don't want to presume that anyone wants to be part of this process if they don't, but we do want to create the opportunities. So like I said, we're working with our partners at PSU to develop the plans to put a finer point on all of that in the next steps. And in the meantime, developing those relationships and working with leadership to ensure that this effort is supported in a sustaining way moving forward. And then we're also offering trainings about federal Indian law and developing resources so that folks can better understand all of the nuances of working with tribes in this space as well. Like I mentioned, we are really committed to engaging folks in this process, especially, like I've said, disproportionately impacted communities and tribes. And, I see that this project will define how we engage with those communities and really everyone internally and externally moving forward. So, just all in a day's work. I wanted to briefly plug also, that's kind of the end of my cleanup specific part of the talk, but with another like 2 minutes, I wanted to plug other commitments that the agency is making to kind of equity focused work. And one of those shining bright spots for me is the agency-wide staff-led environmental justice work group. This was started largely by Jimena Cruz Cuevas and Meenakshi Rao and Francisca Landis and Nicole Singh and others a few years back before my time at DEQ, but it is staff-led and grassroots, and we have different groups focused on community engagement, technical policy planning, and coordinating with leadership. There's a story map link there that I could share if anyone's interested in learning a little bit more. But that group is, gives me hope that we will retain our commitment to all of this moving forward, as well as Oregon's House Bill 4077 was signed. I think actually when I was interviewing for my original toxicology position, I was talking to my hiring manager at the time, and this hadn't been passed by the Oregon legislature yet, but it was like a carrot that he dangled for me. He was like, look, there's going to be this environmental justice bill and there will be more capacity in Oregon to do this work. So this did pass, and there's an environmental justice council statewide that all of the 16 natural resource agencies in Oregon are coordinating with to develop an Oregon-specific environmental justice mapping tool, kind of like EJ Screen nationwide. And so this is pretty exciting too. And then finally, I just wanted to plug that we also, Governor Kotek, asked all agencies in Oregon to put together DEI plans on every biennium, I believe for the first time this year. And so not me, but a lot of folks at DEQ put a lot of time and effort into developing DEQ's current DEI plan for this biennium. And that's something that we're, continuing to work with leadership to make sure is implemented. And with that, I will stop talking and I will take any questions. Thanks, Ian.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Blair. That was really interesting. And in particular, I liked, that there's, as an early career person myself, I like the way you started the talk, thinking about how early projects you worked on kind of shaped your career interests. And clearly you have a lot of experience in that science communication realm. And so I thought I might start there and ask you about challenges with hazard communication to community. And one strategy that I try and implement is sort of that the first rule of good science communication is to know your audience. And so I often try and ask probing questions to try and elicit something from the audience about what their level of kind of scientific literacy is. I'm curious if you implement strategies like that, or kind of how you go about matching the kind of technical specifics that you get into with the different audience member when you may not know much about their background, and kind of how you approach that in your science communication work.
Totally. Yeah, thank you, Ian. That's a great question. So yeah, absolutely agreed that knowing your audience, like you said, is important. And so there's not a one size fits all approach, but I think some of the core principles that I come back to when I think about effective risk or hazard communication are trust and respect. like just basic human, respecting the dignity of whomever is asking the question, and understanding that for them, whatever their perspective is their reality and their perspective. I think a lot of times, especially in sort of ivory tower-esque spaces, we can think that we know best, and we know all, and our understanding is right. And so I think, meeting people where they are, not only, their lived experience, but I think for me that means also fully embodying, trusting, and respecting that is their reality, and that is their lived experience, and that they have that perspective for reasons. And so trying to kind of meet them fully there. And then I mentioned trust. I think, my understanding of a lot of the risk communication literature is that really people don't trust experts, who drop in out of the sky very much. Most often people trust people who they know. Um, and so how do we, something I think about a lot is, how do we as a community of technical professionals do a better job of bridging those gaps, and meeting people where they already are, and getting information, I know there's a lot of good examples of like community engaged liaisons who are trained and then become the trainer, if you will, or become the one who's relaying that information. So with the visioning project, that's something that I hope to do, is actually, and that's what we're planning to do with Portland State, is actually build relationships kind of organically in communities, and identify who those focal people are, who actually already have that trust, as opposed to presuming that, I'm the best person to deliver that information to all those people.
Mhm. Yeah, those are some great points. And I think it's cool to see buy-in at the agency about the need for kind of structural changes. You talk about community liaisons, and I think some of the most productive interactions that I've seen between tribal communities and academic groups, for example, involve real investment of support and resources to build and maintain these relationships over time. I'm thinking about University of New Mexico has a really phenomenal Superfund research program that has really deep engagement with their local Native communities. And my experience with this work is none of this comes for free. It takes real investment to both build and maintain those relationships. I did some work in the Arctic with some Yupik peoples, and it was incredibly challenging to try and maintain these relationships over time when the scientist flies in and does the work and then flies out, and you're trying to maintain these relationships over time with your collaborators through email. And so it's cool to see kind of hopefully institutional buy-in that we need people who can maintain these relationships over time and really invest in this kind of community building. I guess another question that I'd like to ask is, it seems like there's sort of two elements of community engagement. One that's a little more specific and localized, kind of thinking about community feedback on cleanup decisions that are maybe relevant to one particular site. And I'd love to ask you if you have an example that you can think of a way that community feedback shaped the decision making of the agency on how to clean up a site, or kind of what decisions to make. And then my follow-up question will be kind of about the bigger structural changes and kind of programmatic vision, and how you might incorporate community feedback into institutional changes, and what that might look like tangibly.
Yeah, absolutely. So to the first one, I think I'll speak to is actually the project that I shared a picture of. But one of my colleagues, Francisca Landis, who is also very passionate about effective community engagement, was the project manager of this site in North Portland, at Cathedral Park, where it's a city park, and there had been some soil data collected, that had high concentrations of PCBs, but limited resources, all of that, one thing led to another. Data was collected. It's showed high levels of PCBs, but for whatever set of reasons, it wasn't a program priority at that time, or there weren't resources to do anything about it, or there was kind of jurisdictional, whatever reason, nothing had happened for a number of years as far as cleaning it up, or moving forward with the investigation. But then there was a concerned citizens group in North Portland who kind of caught wind of this, and kickstarted something happening. And so it actually led to a really close working relationship between Francesca, who was the project manager, and her team, and our communications professionals, and a whole series of community meetings. But if not for that community concern, then that wouldn't have happened. Actually, I'm remiss if I don't mention Bullseye Glass as well. That's not a cleanup site, but back in 2015, 2016, USGS, I believe. Yeah, I believe it was USGS had done a study around Portland collecting moss samples in trees and looking at metals concentrations. And they noticed higher concentrations of metals close to certain glass manufacturing facilities. And it basically it got into the public eye. Folks found out about this. And there was so much public outcry and so much concern about these metals and the uncertainty about what the metals in the air meant, that Governor Kate Brown at the time ended up mandating that DEQ create a whole new program, Cleaner Air Oregon, which is now our more proactive ambient air quality managing program at DEQ, which that's unheard of a little bit, for something to like come down from the governor as a directive. Like, you have to create a whole new program. Here's funding to build something completely from scratch. We didn't have that regulation before. So that was all community driven. So I think actually the community has a very powerful voice, in ability to impact change at the agency. I think it's just about finding those spaces where you can actually gain traction.
Mhm.
And that might be my answer to the second part of your question. I think we really do hope to, through this process, build coalitions with those folks. And of course, understanding that, folks are busy, everybody's overburdened, not here to presume that everyone has time or space or interest in this process, right? But I think I'm really interested in trying to identify those folks who are, and then work with them to try to figure out how we can actually hopefully create some change.
Well, thank you for that. Some context from our audience here. Kim Marcus chimed in that the U.S. Forest Service did the moss studies, so that's helpful. And another question here from Kim Marcus is, you mentioned that the state of Oregon will develop their own brownfield program. Will it mirror the federal program in terms of funding and regulatory approvals? Thanks.
Absolutely. So yeah, thank you for the correction. That's why I was hesitating, because I couldn't remember if it was the Forest Service or UGS. So thank you. I appreciate that clarification. And then the brownfields program. So I will be, candid and say that is in the beginning stages, sort of like the visioning project. That's, it's in the idea phase right now. So I don't have all the answers about exactly what it will look like. My colleague Rebecca Wells Albers is the main one leading that from the headquarters section of our cleanup program statewide. But it's an idea, it's a concept that's been on the table for a while, and there's been, they've kind of been waiting for the right time with the legislature and funding and everything to pursue it. And so in Oregon right now, one of our governor's priorities is housing. And so, and actually not, the environment is not necessarily explicitly one of her priorities. And so I think there could be an opportunity there to pursue that. And so I think we'll know more as we move through that.
Great. And so I have two questions here that are in some ways related. So I'll read both of them. So one of them is, if there are multiple active DEQ cleanup sites, do DEQ managers prioritize sites with the highest probability of eliciting adverse biological effects? And then the other question is also about prioritizing sites. And it says, I'm curious how you're considering balancing the needs to support disproportionately impacted communities with cleanup decisions when much of the cleanup is driven by economic factors like development that tend to include some of the communities. For example, Eastern Washington compared to Seattle area, in determining which cleanups are done when. So kind of both questions about how we prioritize which sites. One of them thinking about, is it just probability of adverse effects that drive things? Or the other question being, to what extent do we take into account economic concerns, and how might that disproportionately support certain geographic areas or certain groups?
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for the question. Let's see. So how do we prioritize sites right now? I think that a goal of this process will be to develop a more consistent prioritization scheme that is, in my view, would be based more on, like you said, hazards or risks at a site. I think we haven't necessarily had the infrastructure to implement something like that so far, the way that our program is structured, and in part largely because it's a voluntary cleanup program. Not our entire program, but a lot of our sites, folks are coming in voluntarily. So, and these processes can take decades. So it makes it pretty structurally, logistically challenging, but those are the types of really meaty, challenging problems that I'm hoping we're going to dive into in the visioning project, as well as the economic considerations. Economic considerations will always be at the table, and they have been they've been main forces driving a lot of what has happened in the way that our program is structured for the entire time that our program has existed. And so, I talk a lot about centering disproportionately impacted communities and working with these folks because that has not been part of the process. But that's not to suggest that, we're going to ignore economic considerations and, go out into some fairyland or something. That will always be there. And that's why we want to make sure that we're being truly inclusive internally and externally, because like I said, we have a lot of folks who've been in the program for a really long time and are very pragmatic about, what it looks like to do this work. And so we're going to have to figure out how to navigate through all of that and move forward, hopefully as holistically and inclusively as we can.
Mhm. Yeah, well, thank you for that. I think in just the last couple of minutes we have left here, I'd love to ask you about maybe a bright spot from your work at OMSI, maybe a particular interaction you had with an adult or a child that kind of felt like maybe you made an impact and helped someone to understand why, how to make pollution visible. Do you have a story you'd like to share related to your science communication experience there?
That's a great question. Well, there are lots that come to mind. I'm a people person, as you can tell by all of my outreach volunteer experience. And so there are a lot. I mean, and I love kids, and so I love, when you get those moments where you see the light bulbs click for kids. I've had a lot of those, over the years. And I would say, a recent bright spot that comes to mind is actually exactly the day that's pictured here on the screen. That picture on the bottom of the screen is I got people from air, land, and water, and our vehicle inspection program all across DEQ for the first time ever to come together to represent like a bunch of different things from the whole program or the whole agency, including like our air quality app and all these different aspects, and our water quality. Like there were folks from water quality who went and took a stream sample from the Clackamas River and had like little larval, or macro inverts and things like that swimming around on this table. There was a larval crayfish in there, which like I did crayfish research in one of my projects in grad school, so it was super cool to me. So that was a huge bright spot for me, seeing, that wouldn't have happened if I hadn't tried to make it happen, so getting all those folks together, from air, land, water, climate, to have, real conversations with folks about, how do you use our air quality app if there's a wildfire, as everything from that to what is our vehicle inspection program doing to what is this larval crayfish, so seeing those connections and that gives me hope for more of that.
Fantastic. Well, that's great. Yeah, good for people to see that DEQ is doing so much important work, and it's not just about vehicle inspections, which is how many people interface with DEQ in Oregon.
Yes.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate your presentation in our speaker series, and with that, we'll conclude this month's seminar. Thank you so much, Blair.
Thanks, Ian.
All right, bye-bye.